Hello, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's event with Jeremy Hunt and Ryan Henson from the Coalition for Global Prosperity. Welcome to Big Tent. It's just a virtual tent these days, though we hope that will change. If this is your first event, then please tell you a bit about us. We are a different kind of political festival that believes in open conversations, a non-partisan approach, and is really, really fantastic and welcoming to all comers, all opinions. And we're absolutely delighted to have Brian and Jeremy in conversation today about a sort of typically small issue that we like to address, which is what is Britain's future role in the world. I'm Polly Mackenzie. I am one of the board directors of the Big Tent Festival. This is Edmund. He is not on the board, but I'm sure he will be someday. I've just got a few housekeeping notes for you, as you've seen in the slideshow. The session is being recorded, so there'll be an informal, unrecorded session at the end. If you'd like to watch a replay, children and dogs, don't work with them. If you'd like to watch a replay, you'd be able to do so afterwards. If you're not already a friend or supporter of the Big Tent, we would love to have you within our family, and you can find out more about that on our website. I've just lost the instructions which tell me exactly how you can ask a question, because my son stole them. So I'm guessing that the answer is the usual one, which is that you can put them in the chat, and Ryan, who is during the conversation, will be able to bring those forward in conversation with Jeremy. So without further ado, over to Ryan.
Well, thank you, Polly, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm really thrilled to be chairing this discussion today. I'm going to say a few words about the Coalition for Global Prosperity, and then I will introduce our fantastic guest. So the Coalition for Global Prosperity was established 2 years ago because we believe that Britain is at its very best when we act as a force for good in the world, and that a smart and effective aid budget, leveraging British expertise and British values, really can and does transform lives across the world. And this has been proven time and time again, whether it's peace building, global health security, or economic development and job creation. Our aid budget really does make a huge difference. And it helps make for a more prosperous place for all of us. So it's not just morally right to support those who are overseas who are worse off than us. It's in our national interest as well. When we tackle Ebola in Sierra Leone, prevent drug trafficking in Tanzania, train Lebanese forces to fight Daesh, we prevent disease, drugs and extremism from landing on Britain's streets. And we meet at such a critical time to be discussing foreign affairs. In September, there will be a new Foreign Development and Commonwealth Office. I may have got the words a bit back to front. And in the autumn, the government will publish details of its integrated review of foreign policy, defence, security and international development. And of course, as none of us could forget, there will be a US election in November. So it gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce our guest today, who has really been in the room when the big decisions have been made over the past decade, and of course has been taking many of the big decisions that have happened in politics over the past decade. Jeremy is a former Foreign Secretary, a former Health Secretary, and is currently chair of the Health Select Committee. Jeremy, we are absolutely delighted to have you with us this afternoon, and I will now hand over to you for some opening remarks.
Well, good afternoon, Edmund. Not good afternoon, Edmund. I was thinking of Polly's son, Edmund. Good afternoon, Ryan, only because I've got my own 6-year-old daughter whose birthday it is today. So you may hear some other children running around delightedly because spirits are very high. But it's a real pleasure. This is my first Big Tent event. I've long admired the work that you've been doing and indeed been a great fan of George Freeman, who I know has been very involved in setting up Big Tent. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to all the incisive questions that you're going to put to me.
Fantastic. Well, we've got lots of questions that have been pre-submitted ahead of the event. But before we get to those, I wonder, Jeremy, just if you could kick us off with saying a bit about your experience of foreign affairs and international development before you went into politics. And I'm thinking particularly of the charity in Kenya that you helped to establish, which supported children living with HIV. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, thanks, Ryan. I mean, I'm always been a big supporter of international development. And in fact, the first job I did as an MP in the House of Commons was to join the International Development Select Committee. And the reason for that was because I got involved supporting a charity that helps AIDS orphans in Nairobi, and became very familiar with the real tragedy of HIV/AIDS in Africa. And that stayed with me when I went into Parliament. And I was a big admirer of Hilary Benn during his time at DFID, and in fact worked closely with him on HIV/AIDS policy. So yes, it certainly shaped me in those early days, and I hope had some influence on my way of thinking when I was Foreign Secretary as well.
Great, thank you. So if we take, first of all, the question which lots of us are thinking about following the decision by the Prime Minister to merge DFID with the FCO, could you tell us your thoughts on the merger in general? And perhaps looking at it a bit more closely, the Prime Minister said when he announced that the merger was taking place that the distinction between diplomacy and development was outdated. Could you perhaps touch on that as well?
Yes, this was a decision or a possible way forward that I wrestled with when I was Foreign Secretary. And I think it's a genuinely very difficult, finely nuanced decision. And I'll explain why. I mean, I'm, like you, a huge supporter of international development, big supporter of our 0.7% promise. And the reason I hesitated to advocate this when I was Foreign Secretary is because DFID is a world-beating organisation. I mean, it is respected as the premier international development organisation of any major country, and it does Britain proud in many parts of the world. So I think you always think carefully before you want to make a change to an organisation that I think really has earned its spurs. But I also think it's true that the world has changed quite a lot since DFID was set up. And when DFID was set up, the primary focus was to end the grinding absolute poverty that was prevalent in large parts of Asia and Africa. Not the only places that it was present, but those were where the largest concentrations of that poverty was. Since then, and we all think back to the sort of Band-Aid days and the amazing 2005 Gleneagles Summit, where huge work was done on HIV/AIDS. But since then, Africa and Asia, pretty much everywhere, has caught the capitalist bug, and they've worked out how to develop strong and prosperous economies. And really now what we've got is a battle for ideas between the autocratic development route and the open society development route. So what I found as Foreign Secretary was that what I was advocating for when I went to African countries was as much about the freedom of journalists, for example, avoiding political repression. There are other development partners like China who are increasingly strong in Africa who ask no questions at all about governance or human rights. And I did find that there was sometimes my voice wasn't as strong as I wanted it to be because I wasn't the person speaking with the checkbook. That was the International Development Secretary. So I think as Britain increasingly advocates for the importance of open societies, for freedom, for liberal democratic values, we want to speak with as powerful a voice as possible. And increasingly our development effort is going to be on those broader agendas and not just the issue of poverty, important though that is. And I can see that bringing the two departments together could give our Foreign Secretary that stronger voice, as long as in the process of doing it, we are not in any way seen to reduce our commitment to tackling the grinding poverty, which still remains a scar on the face of the world.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask one more question just before I turn over to the ones that have been pre-submitted, because you've you've touched on it there in your answer about China and the autocratic alternative, if you like. So I'm thinking about your New Statesman article from last week, which I really enjoyed. And for anyone who hasn't read it, I really recommend that you give it a read. But Jeremy, in the article, you said that Ernest Bevin deserves lots of credit for sort of helping to establish some of the institutions that we perhaps take for granted today. He was a real titan of the Attlee government. How do you think he'd have responded to some of the actions of China and Russia, which have dominated the headlines in recent weeks? And is there anything we can learn from the way he responded to his opponents or challenges at the time?
Well, Andrew Donis has just written an excellent book on Ernest Bevin, and I'm very pleased he has, because when people think of the Attlee government, they tend to remember the other person with a very similar name, but with Bevan, not Bevin. They think of Nye Bevin, who was the founder of the NHS and is rightly revered for his role in doing that. But much as I admire Nye Bevin, I actually think that Ernest Bevin is as worthy of praise, because in that Attlee government, he was really the person who put in place the post-war settlement, including the foundation of NATO, the setting up of the United Nations, the foundation of the modern West Germany. And he was a fascinating man because he came from a very, very poor background, so poor that he, in his teenage years, he had to beg and steal to get food. And he moved up into the Labour Party through the union movement. And that gave him, interestingly, an abiding hatred for Stalinism and the extreme left. And then he became foreign secretary, and he actually had to square off against Stalin. And he was never taken in the way that much of the British establishment was taken in by the kind of utopian dreams of what was happening in the Soviet Union. He was completely clear-eyed about the dangers of communism. So how would he have reacted? I think he would have understood that, important though it is to raise the standards of living for everyone in society, and China has been extremely successful at that, and we should want China to go on being successful because they've been staggeringly successful. We do not share their values when it comes to freedom of the individual and human rights, and we need to be very clear about those differences in values. And we need to find a way to live alongside China, because it's going to continue to grow and become more powerful, and they are going to be a very important part of the international order. And we want to continue to trade with them. But we need to find a way of doing that defends and protects our own democratic values. And that is the thinking that hasn't really happened to date, and urgently does need to happen. And that was really what I was arguing in my New Statesman argument. I think Britain, as a medium-sized power, could play a very important role, because we have a unique set of alliances through our traditional alliance with the United States and NATO, our long-standing friendships with our European neighbours, which I think will continue despite Brexit, our links to the Commonwealth, our links to countries like Japan. And I think we have got to find a way, as the democracies of the world, of working together to say, look, we welcome the rise of China. We want China to be prosperous and successful, but we need to find a way of making that happen in a way that doesn't threaten our democratic values.
Thank you. We'll take a question now from Louis Portal, who is going to ask the question himself. If you're there, Louis? If not, I can read it out. Okay, I'll go for it. But Louis, if you're there, just interrupt me. Jeremy, Louis' question is: are there any significant changes to the unwritten British Constitution that you would consider reasonable to consider? And if yes, what would they be?
Well, thank you, Louis. And it's a very important question. And the answer to that is yes. I think that we have been through a lot of big constitutional change in the last 25 years, starting really with the setting up of the Scottish Parliament, Welsh Assembly, and then the big changes that we've had in Northern Ireland, and then Brexit. And all these things are very significant changes. And I have come to the view that because constitutional changes are really the rule book upon which our national life operates, we should have some of the checks and balances that other countries have before governments can change the Constitution by a simple vote in the House of Commons. So, for example, in America, if you want to change the Constitution, it requires a 2/3 vote of both Congress and the Senate and the President. So there's a real block to snap changes in the Constitution. And I think we should do that here. And that's why I think the way to do that would be to have an elected House of Lords operating in the same way or a similar way to the way the Senate operates in the US, with just 100 members elected for large geographical constituencies. And once the House of Lords had democratic legitimacy, I think you could then give it a veto on constitutional changes. You could say that if we're going to make changes to the Constitution, it requires a 2/3 majority of both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So that's the change I would make, just to make sure that when we do make these changes, really big changes, they're done in a way that is really thoughtful and considered for the future.
Thank you. If I can just pick up on the example that you've given of the United States, with the election coming up in November, you were obviously Foreign Secretary for a part of President Trump's term, or his first term at least. What are your thoughts ahead of the election, and what do you think, depending on who wins, the consequences might be for UK foreign policy, or what sort of things should decision makers be thinking about ahead of November?
Well, it's obviously a very, very important thing in terms of our diplomacy. And the straight answer to your question, Ryan, is that the British government has to find a way to work with whoever is the next president of the United States, because they are our most important ally. And, we, I think over the years, have shown that we can work with administrations of whatever party is in control in Washington. But this is a particularly important moment, because as I talk about in my New Statesman article, we had a kind of golden period in terms of the kind of democratic values that I imagine people in Big Tent would all support, from the fall of the Berlin Wall until about 2012, 2013, when the number of democracies around the world dramatically increased, with huge numbers of new democracies in Eastern Europe and across Africa and Asia. And really, we could feel very confident that the values that we believe in were going to continue to progress around different corners of the world. That has changed in the last 5 years. And we have a much more assertive China and a much more aggressive Russia. And this is a period where, if we want to protect those values in the next 50 years, the democracies of the world are going to have to start working together much more closely in the way that we did during the period of the Cold War. I hope we don't move into a second Cold War, but we learned that we had to work together to defend our shared values. And the good news here is that if you look in the history of the world, most alliances have tended to be transactional alliances. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But the Western alliance that both won in the Second World War and won in the Cold War was a different type of alliance. It was a values-based alliance. And those alliances tend to be stronger when two countries come together because they share common ideals. The alliances tend to have stronger and deeper foundations. And of course, that was the great miscalculation that both Hitler made and the Soviet Union made. They were certain that us decadent capitalists could be split up and divided, but they actually found that alliance, because it's based on shared beliefs, is one of the strongest alliances you have. Now, we need to reconstitute that alliance going forward. And of course, the most important country in that equation is the world's most powerful democracy, which is the United States. And so the role of Britain is going to be to stand alongside the United States and help it rebuild that international alliance. And, that's obviously who is inside the White House will make a very big difference in that respect.
Thank you very much. Right, our next question comes from Pam Sale, and Pam has asked me to read the question. Mr. Hunt, could you explain why the findings from the Cygnus pandemic exercise in 2016 were not acted on? Which department would have been responsible for addressing the findings, and how should the structure of government be changed so that any such exercise in future be acted on?
Well, it's a fascinating question, Pam, and I think I'll give you the answer that you want, which is that I was the Secretary of State responsible for that operation. It was a pandemic flu exercise, and it was my department that was responsible as well. And it was a very big, comprehensive pandemic preparation exercise. Took place over 3 days, a huge amount of work. It didn't get any publicity because it was a planning exercise, but nor did we avoid any publicity over it. All the findings from that exercise actually were leaked to The Guardian a few months ago. And indeed, all the recommendations made to ministers on the basis of that exercise were implemented. And you don't need to take my word for it. The permanent secretary at the Department of Health and Social Care confirmed that to the Public Accounts Committee at the House of Commons. So we did what the recommendations asked us to do. But what is fascinating looking back is that there wasn't a single recommendation to increase the PPE stockpile and not a single recommendation to increase our testing capacity. And that was because it was an exercise based on pandemic flu. And what I have to take responsibility for, as someone who was health secretary for nearly 6 years, is that we had a kind of groupthink while I was health secretary, before I was health secretary, after I stopped being health secretary, that basically said pandemic equals influenza. And what we have this time, is a SARS MERS-like virus, which requires a very different response, the most striking element of which is the need to carry on testing large numbers so that you continue to isolate people as quickly as possible as a way of containing the virus, which is you can't do in flu because after a certain point it just spreads so quickly. It's just not possible to do that. And I think we can see now that the countries that were the most effective in tackling coronavirus were countries that followed the SARS, MERS playbook, particularly countries that had experience of dealing with SARS, like South Korea, Singapore, places like Taiwan and Hong Kong. And that really was why at the start of January, you can see from the SAGE, the Government Advisory Committee minutes, that it was part of the strategy to stop testing after a certain point. And that it was clear they write down in those minutes that it's the right thing to discontinue testing, which we actually stopped on March the 12th, because we were following that flu playbook. And I'm sure that will be one of the biggest lessons that comes out of the independent inquiry that the Prime Minister has announced there's going to be.
Thank you. I'm sticking with the theme of pandemics. I've got a question from Jason Chambers, who's asked me to ask on his behalf. How does Mr. Hunt feel that COVID-19 is going to impact on the developing countries' economies in the future? Well,
obviously it's going to be hugely negative, but we still don't quite understand why, as of now, it hasn't had the huge impact in Africa that we've been expecting. It arrived in Africa later than other countries, and parts of Africa are in lockdown now. And one of the questions that we are wrestling with is whether the reason why it hasn't appeared to have the impact is a measurement issue, because they don't have the infrastructure to measure it, whether it's because they have much younger populations than we have, whether it's because they don't have issues around obesity, for example, that we have. But we are still very worried about Africa because they have a much less developed healthcare system, so they would have much less resilience. But the answer is that even if it doesn't actually directly affect the poorest countries, it is going to affect them economically, because it's going to put the Western world into a very deep recession. And that will have a knock-on effect and may well turn into a global recession. I think is almost certain that it will. So that's why we have to think about our responsibilities to those countries more than ever, and recognise that this is going to be a period where we need to support countries that are likely to be in a great deal of distress.
Thank you. And on that topic, I'm going to ask Libby Smith to ask her question.
Hello, Libby.
Hi, all. Thanks so much, Ryan. You referenced the merger before, but my question, Judith Hunt, is that obviously you know firsthand how demanding and large the remit the role of Foreign Secretary is. Therefore, do you think that following the DFID and SCO merger, it would be beneficial to have a development lead in the new SCDO department? So, for example, a chief secretary for development to oversee this work, similar to what you have in the Treasury?
Yes, I do, Libby, and I've said publicly, I think it's really important that the junior Foreign Office minister, who's responsible for what we now call DFID, has a seat round the table in the cabinet. I think that's a very important signal to send to the rest of the world that we are absolutely not reducing our commitment to development. And indeed, there are other departments, not just the Treasury, but at different times. When I was in the cabinet, the immigration minister used to sit around the cabinet table. We've sometimes had the climate change minister sitting around the cabinet table. So I think that would be a really good way to reassure people that this is a kind of downgrading of our commitment to development, which certainly isn't. And I've asked Boris Johnson a question about that on the floor of the House of Commons, and he said he would look into that. So I very much hope that happens.
I've now got a question from James Blackwell, a more challenging question, which has asked me to read. How can Britain recover from its migration to brutish, dishonest, autocratic government that justifies any means to achieve its aims?
Well, I don't recognise that description. And I'm someone who stood against Boris Johnson for the leadership of the Conservative Party. In fact, a year ago tomorrow was when the result of that contest was announced. So, I'm someone who's not been afraid to speak out when I've disagreed with things that he's done. But I think people who are opponents of Boris have sometimes wrongly interpreted his strong belief in Brexit as being part of a wider illiberal agenda. And I don't believe it is. And, if I just look at, for example, what he's said on the NHS and his commitment to maintain the increased funding settlement that I negotiated, what he said about doing the same for social care, the extra hospitals that he wants to build. People, pick apart at the small print of some of these pledges, but there is absolutely a pledge to invest more in our public services than perhaps a traditional Conservative government would, 20,000 police officers and so on. And I think when it comes to things like immigration, what we will see is a more liberal immigration policy than perhaps some people fear. I hope so. I'm a believer in the benefits of immigration. I'm married to an immigrant, and I think we benefit enormously as a society from having the best of people from all around the world. And I actually think that that's what Boris was like when he was Mayor of London, and I suspect that's what he'll be like as Prime Minister. So I think when we've got Brexit behind us, we will see we will see someone who is more centrist in his approach. But that doesn't mean that he won't break eggs to crack omelettes. And I think perhaps we should, given the power of Dominic Cummings in the Downing Street operation, it's worth remembering that Dominic Cummings cut his teeth as a special advisor in the Department for Education under Michael Gove, where some very big controversial reforms happened. They happened with a lot of noise and a lot of controversy, but the net result was a significant improvement in standards in state schools. And so if we are able to go back to the country in 2024 with those kinds of reforms under our belt, then I think that would be a positive thing. And I don't think that would be a big move the Conservative Party to the right.
Thank you. Can I ask, just on that topic, the point that it's been a year since the result of the Conservative leadership, could you tell us a bit about what it's like serving at the top of government? You were the longest serving health secretary. You held one of the great offices of state at the FCO, obviously incredibly busy now. But what is it like as a minister maintaining that level of focus and engagement for such a sustained period?
Well, it's a privilege. Madeleine Albright, who was Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, what Mike Pompeo does now, she said to me when I was Foreign Secretary and just become Foreign Secretary, and I met her over a lunch, and she said to me, "Jeremy, never forget what an honour it is to represent your country." She's absolutely right. But actually, it is an honour to sit round that cabinet table and take part in the big decisions of the day. And, the biggest area which I focused on was raising standards in the NHS, because I came to realise that in the NHS, as in all healthcare systems, we have a huge number of avoidable deaths and harm, about 150 avoidable deaths every week. And we can sort out a lot of those tragedies if we get better at learning from mistakes that we have in our country, but actually, as I say, in every healthcare system. When someone dies because of a mistake, it's incredibly hard to be open about it. The lawyers get involved. And so we need to change the culture in medicine to make that possible. Being involved in those decisions is a massive privilege. But it's also like being on a hamster wheel, and you're going faster and faster, and you don't actually necessarily always notice that you're going faster and faster. And you think you're being a reasonably good dad and a reasonably good husband because you're blocking off time on Sundays or whatever for your family. But actually, you're quite preoccupied because you're thinking about the big appearances you've got in the week ahead. You're wondering, what's going to be said on the Andrew Marr show or in the Sunday papers. So even the times when you're at home, you're not present mentally, even if you're present physically. And in the Conservative Party leadership campaign, I remember that we were flown around the country by helicopter in order to go to all these hustings in different parts of the country. And on one of the journeys, Conservative Party headquarters said I could take my wife and my son, John, who was 8 years old at the time. And I looked at him sitting opposite me in the helicopter. It was a great thrill to have him with me. And I realised I'd been a cabinet minister for every minute that he'd been alive, and indeed the same for his two younger sisters. And I would have loved to have stayed as Foreign Secretary, but I thought if I'm not going to be Foreign Secretary, actually, I want to have a bit more time for my family and a bit more time for my constituency as well. And the last year has been the most wonderful joy. So I've really far more. I thought I was going to be very depressed and feel out of sorts. I've actually really enjoyed myself. And when Boris celebrates his first year in office on Friday, I shall be taking my son to Paris for the weekend. It's the first time I've ever been on a trip with him, just the two of us. So it's a big family moment. And I am really looking forward to it as we walk around the Louvre with our face masks on. I think it'll be a lovely time.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm now going to ask Claire De Silva to ask her question. Claire.
Hi, thanks, Ryan, and thanks, Jeremy.
Hi, Claire.
Hello. I'm just kind of wondering, it feels like everything's up in the air. All our normal points of reference have changed in the last little while. So how important do you think it is, and how should we maintain our global legacy of supporting the world's poorest, particularly in a post-Brexit, post-DFID, and possibly even eventually post-COVID world?
Well, I think we must absolutely maintain that commitment, because fundamentally we are all the same human beings, whether you're born in the Central African Republic or Vietnam or London. And, I think that is part of our British values. They're not just British values. I think they're values that are shared by decent people all around the world. So I hope we never become an insular country that wants to pull up the drawbridge and say, it's not our problem. And if we look at our history, we were talking about Ernest Bevin before, Britain has played a very big role in shaping the world. I think we're one of 4 or 5 countries that has played a definitive role in shaping the world that we're in. Now, some people say that history is about the rise and fall of empires, and we had the British Empire, and then we had American leadership, and this century is going to be Chinese leadership, and for sure the Chinese economy will overtake the US economy at some stage in the next 10 to 20 years. But that's not how I see history. I think history is about the rise and fall of ideas. And I think the liberal democratic ideas, I should say democratic liberal ideas, so this isn't confused with a political party, thinking of Polly listening to this conversation, but I think those democratic liberal ideas are the best ways that human beings have found to organise societies. I think the open debate between ideas is the best way to progress those ideas. I think property rights, choosing your leader, holding them to account through a free and fair press. My goodness me, we've seen in the last 5 years that our systems aren't perfect, and there are problems in our systems, but they are so much better than the alternative. So I think that that's what we have to focus on going forward. If we want to be a powerful, influential country in the world, it will be because of the things we do, not just for our narrow national interest, but for the global interest. And I think we have always been, alongside the United States, the greatest champion for open societies. And, I think people are completely wrong when they say that Britain is a spent force and people aren't interested in Britain anymore. I was very struck as Foreign Secretary. I visited 29 countries during my year as Foreign Secretary, and people have a whole lot more respect for us in other countries than we sometimes have for ourselves. And that is because they see us as a country that has championed many of the things that have been a force for good in the modern world. We can't neglect the things we've got wrong. Our role in setting up the slave trade is the one that's been most topical recently, but also, our role in championing independent legal systems, democratic rights, human rights, development more recently. These are things which Britain is respected for. And I think if we want to play a big role and be one of the 5, 6 most influential countries on the planet in 50 years' time, we absolutely can be. But we have to recognise that there are trade-offs if that's what we want to do. But I hope we play that role.
Thank you very much. I've now got a question from Ben Rich, which Ben's asked me to read it. Is the lesson of COVID that the NHS needs to be more centralised, as reports in The Guardian suggest, or is Her Majesty's government plan, does the government sort of plan to head in that direction anyway?
Well, it's a good question, Ben, and the NHS has always had this tussle between whether you give lots of local autonomy so that managers are free and doctors are free to innovate. And of course, heavy-handed bureaucracies are never the best way to run things. And the NHS is the 5th largest organisation in the world. In fact, ranked against GDP, if the NHS was a country, it would be the 33rd largest country in the world. And so you can see the potential for a very stifling bureaucracy in an organisation of 1.4 million people. And I do think some of our big national targets, when we tot up the A&E waiting times for 50 million citizens and turn it into one target, we're pretty much the only country, or one of the very few countries in the world that do that. I think every hospital should have its own target to see people within 4 hours and so on. I do think that we should loosen the reins. And I think the way that we loosen the reins and stop the NHS becoming too bureaucratic is by more transparency about how safe and effective the care is that's being given. So when I was Health Secretary, I introduced the Ofsted system so that every hospital now gets ranked as outstanding, good, requires improvement, or inadequate. So does every GP surgery, so does every care home. And that has created transparency, so we know how good our hospital is. It creates a pressure to improve, because the great thing about the Ofsted system is that you don't just give someone a ranking like your A-level results. You also tell them what they can do to improve. This is what you got a good ranking, and this is what you could do to become an outstanding hospital next time. And I think once you've got that kind of transparency in place, you can actually back off from some of the national targets and let local people do what they need to do to improve the quality and safety of care. So that would be the approach that I think would work best.
Thank you. We've now got a question from Carl Hunter. Carl.
Thanks, Ryan. Hello, Jeremy.
Hi, Carl.
Yeah, nice to see you. When you were the brilliant Foreign Secretary that you were, you spoke intriguingly about a role for the United Kingdom being an invisible thread that joined the democracies of the world. I wondered, a year on, or year or two on, whether you could expand on that.
Well, thank you, Carl, and very nice to see you too. And yes, perhaps the only word that was wrong in that phrase is the word invisible, because I think it's become very clear in the last year that we do need the democracies of the world to join together. And Britain has an absolutely unique role in doing that because of our history of championing democratic values and the strong links that we have with democracies across the world. And knowing your interest in defence matters, let me sort of point to one uncomfortable truth that we need to address. If we want there to be a stronger, the two great centres of democracy in the world are Europe and the United States, North America. Not that there aren't other very, very important democracies in other parts of the world, but if we want those two groups of democracies to work together very well, we have to recognise that it's not sustainable for the United States to be spending 4% of its GDP on defence, and everywhere in Europe spending between 1% and 2% of its GDP. And the situation we're in now, and we're obviously thinking, following yesterday's headlines about Russian aggression, well, the situation we're in now is that about 40% of the cost of defending Europe and keeping Europe safe is paid for by American taxpayers. So it's a big mistake when you look at that situation to say this is a Trump issue, Trump is upping the ante. These are issues that President Obama raised, that the President Clinton raised, President Bush raised. We've got to recognise going forward that if we're going to have a sustainable Western alliance, we're all going to have to make a contribution. And that might not be traditional defence. It could be cyber, it could be space, it could be what happens in the Arctic, it could be what happens in the Pacific. But that is one of the trade-offs. If we want Britain to have a strong voice in the world, then people are going to recognise, people are going to say, well, you're one of the countries that has very effective armed forces, and you've shown you're prepared to use them in certain situations. Are you properly investing and backing them? And I think we should.
Thank you.
We've got about 10 minutes left for questions, so I'm going to see if I can whiz through some of those that have come into the chat. And my next question is from Diana Duamena, who's asked me to read the question on her behalf. Britain, through Brexit and its immigration policies and social tensions, is perceived to be closing its doors to young Africans and Asians. Are individuals from these communities not the link into the developing markets and most of the Commonwealth Britain needs to maintain strong relationships with?
Thank you, Diana. Very important question. My wife is Chinese. I have been known to muddle up her nationality in the past, but she is very firmly Chinese. So she's part of that generation that you're talking about, who are helping to build those links between Britain and other parts of the world. I don't believe, and I've never believed, that Brexit Britain is going to be a Britain that closes its doors to the rest of the world. There is a kind of Little England view. There are people who believe that, but this is the Conservative Party, not UKIP, and that is not our tradition. And I think that because the passions in the Brexit debate were so heated, many people on the Remain side came to believe that Brexit was going to be a big cultural change where that kind of thing happened. And the only way that we can persuade people like you that that's not the case is by our actions and not by our words. So I hope you will see from the immigration policy that the government announces that we move into from next year, that we do remain open to talent from all over the world, and that we continue to build on what one of our greatest strengths are, which is that we are one of the most liberal, tolerant, outward-looking societies in the world. We're not perfect. We still have invisible barriers, glass ceilings, and things that we have to tackle. But I think, our natural character as a country is a tolerant place, and that's what we've got to show people is not just safe and secure, but one of our great national assets that we want to build on.
Thank you. Our next question in the chat is from Joel Popula. Joel, if you want to ask the question yourself, jump in, and I'll start reading it just in case. Early this year, about 15 African presidents were in London to attend the inaugural UK-Africa Investment Summit to jumpstart a new trading relationship with African countries. Post-Brexit, and with the effects of COVID-19 on the world economy at large, the need for new trading relationships between the UK and Africa becomes more pertinent. Is the UK late to this game, considering a long-standing trade relationship that other major economies like China, USA, Japan are currently having with African countries?
I think we have been a bit late to the game in Africa, because I went on a big trip to 5 African countries when I was Foreign Secretary last May. And what was fascinating to me was that the conversation they wanted to have was not about development. It was about tech hubs, financial services in the City of London, investment opportunities, all the things that Britain could do to help them grow their economy. That was what they wanted to talk about. And I think we've tended to see Africa through the prism of aid, when now there are a lot of very go-ahead governments in Africa that are really trying to grow their economies fast. But what I would say as a more general point is that because of Brexit, understandably, people talk about trade deals a lot. And trade deals matter, they are important, but you can trade without trade deals. And the reason that there are so many BMWs in Mozambique isn't because of any trade deal between Germany or the EU and Mozambique. It's because the Germans make bloody good cars, and people want to buy the things they make. And if we are going to be successful in the 21st century and pay for all the things that I would like us to do, like a decent aid budget, like our armed forces, like the social care system, then we shouldn't get too focused on the role of trade deals. What actually matters is the underlying competitiveness of our economy in the 21st century. And I think the biggest opportunity that we can embrace in that respect is our technology and life sciences sector, where we do quite well, but we're not the next Silicon Valley, and we could become the world's next Silicon Valley if we really put our mind to it, and that would set us up for the 21st century in a way that I think would be very powerful.
That leads us into a really good question from Stephen Day, who asks, the 20th century was dominated by the USA. The 21st century is likely to be dominated by China. Post-Brexit, how can Britain walk the fine line between our traditional friend and the new order while protecting Britain's interests?
Well, like I said to you, I don't believe that history is fundamentally about the rise and fall of empires in the way that question suggests. And I think Western democratic liberal values are more on the ascendant than they've ever been, but we've got to fight for them. And so I think that's what our role has got to be. But let me add a point about China, because China is predicted in about 15 years' time on current trends to overtake the United States as the world's largest economy. That will be a very significant moment, because it'll be the first time in our lifetimes that the world's largest economy has not been a democracy. And that will change the way that we and the rest of the world look at things in a very significant way. But when that happens, China's GDP per head will only be a quarter of US GDP per head. And what I mean by that, because China's going to continue to grow, is that there will come a time, probably not our lifetimes, but thereafter, where China has a GDP that is perhaps 4 times the size of American GDP. So China's going to be around. And I think the direction of travel under its current president has been much more aggressive and assertive. And I think that's been very disappointing. But I think we need to think about how we're going to coexist with China, how we can protect our own values, and how, if we work together with our democracies, we can encourage Chinese growth to be in a direction that is more consistent with the things that we believe in, because we're not going to stop the rise of China. But if we work together, we have more chance of being able to shape it.
Thank you. We've got a couple of minutes left. I just want to dig into that point a bit more. It'd be good to get your thoughts on how you think we get the balance right between standing up for human rights while also recognising that the domestic appetite for intervention, particularly if the consequences of interventions have a knock-on effect on trade and then by extension the pound in someone's pocket, might not be as strong. So it's getting, I suppose, that balance between speaking out against vested interests even when the consequences perhaps aren't always helpful in other areas. Do you think the sort of, so far we've got that balance right in reaction to what's happening in Hong Kong? Do you think there's further we should push?
Well, I think Dominic Raab has shown great leadership on Hong Kong with it, and also with his introduction of Magnitsky sanctions. And as a former human rights lawyer, I think he takes a very personal interest in human rights issues, and he's done a very good job on this. So the way I look at this is, Britain stands for a certain set of values. We're not the only country that believes in those values, but we're very closely associated with those values. And it is a betrayal of our values if we don't stand up for them. But you have to do these things differently in different situations. So when it comes to human rights abuses in Venezuela, you can call them out publicly, and very often that's the most effective and sensible thing to do. When it comes to human rights abuses in China, sometimes it's more effective to raise issues privately, because if you raise them publicly, the risk is that you cut off all contacts with the Chinese, and then you lose the chance to have any influence at all. Likewise with regimes that do things that are contrary to our values, but we have strategic partnerships with, like Saudi Arabia. And I always felt, as Foreign Secretary, the key issue is not whether you were raising these issues publicly, but whether you are always raising them in the most effective way to get change. And so I think we should always do that. But we need to recognize that, we have to have diplomatic relations with everyone. And so the way that we raise these issues may change from country to country.
Great, thank you. We're almost out of time. Jeremy, I think I speak for everyone who's joined today when I say that it's been a really fascinating hour. So thank you so much. We have a few minutes left. Are there any final thoughts you would like to share with us?
Well, thank you. I think, this is a moment where, there's a lot of, there's been a lot of political upheaval, and there's a lot of debate around ideas. But I think this is a moment where people who believe in open societies are going to have to work harder than we've had to work in previous decades to stand up for what we believe in. I grew up in the 1980s. My dad was in the Navy, so I was always thinking about the Cold War. And that was a period where, we didn't know that the Soviet Union was going to collapse in 1989, and we were worried about a potential nuclear war. And so we thought very hard about Western values, and we debated them, and we took the steps we had to take to protect and preserve them. Now, I think it would be a big mistake to say China is the next Soviet Union. And one of the reasons we defeated the Soviet Union was because we bankrupted their economy. That's not going to happen with China. And so we have to be much smarter in our approach. But nonetheless, we have to recognize that there is competition in the market for ideas. And so I think Britain has a really important role in forging an international alliance in defense of open societies. I hope we can all play our part. I hope you can play your part in the big tent too.
It's great, Jeremy. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of our formal discussion this afternoon. The room is going to stay open for a bit longer for an informal discussion for those who would like to stay.
Thank you very much indeed, Ryan. It's been a great pleasure.